And yes, it occurred.
Like we're on trees? Or?
Yeah, okay. So, because of supply chain bottlenecks. That's what I'm talking about. There was a labor
Policy
shortage
choices
because
were made.
of COVID.
Policy choices
and then there
were
was
made.
this thing called greedflation, which was called a left-wing conspiracy theory. But then we saw record returns for corporations.
Emma Vigeland from The Majority Report with Sam Cedar appeared as a guest on Abby Phillips's CNN show, where she went head-to-head with the often smug MAGA commentator Scott Jennings, a figure I personally love to dislike. So let's take a look at this clip from Abby Phillips's show, in which Emma Vigeland completely outmaneuvers Scott Jennings. And as we watch, I'll share my thoughts along the way. And afterward, I want to hear what you think about it in the comments. So let's get into it.
Problem with the economy, it's the other guy's fault, the last guy.
We inherited a mess, affordability, but you can call it affordability or anything you want, but the Democrats caused the affordability problem, and we're the ones that are fixing it.
Remember when Trump said this about his tariffs back in April?
Maybe the children will have $2 instead of $30, and maybe the $2 will cost a couple of bucks more than they would normally.
Well, it is officially doll season, and a growing number of Americans are actually struggling right now in this economy. A new Fed survey found more Americans say that their finances are, quote, much worse now than they were a year ago. And they don't expect it to get any better in the next year either. Trump's approval rating on the economy has plummeted 15 points since he's taken office. And despite the president saying that the economy is great, he's now giving a $12 billion bailout to farmers who were hurt by his own tariffs. Justin Amash said this, a former GOP representative. He said, Trump swipes money from taxpayers to bail out the farmers who were harmed by the tariffs that Trump himself placed on American businesses and consumers. This is the Trump economy. Senator Flake.
Can't argue with that. On tariffs, tariffs are inflationary. That has been a GOP article of faith forever. And it's true. And we're finding that out. There's been some time to get there, but we're there, certainly. And I think that next year it'll even be worse unless there's some reversal on tariffs. We've seen bits and pieces shift, certain sectors exempt and certain countries exempt, but overall it's starting to bite. Consumers are paying more and they're feeling it. Yeah, and you can't tell them otherwise.
Well, yeah, and Trump is not only trying to tell them otherwise, but is also not acknowledging what his own actions are showing, which is that he's bailing out farmers, rolling back some tariffs on food items. Those seem to be clear acknowledgments that the tariff policy has hurt Americans.
Well, I think on the agriculture piece, there's a couple things going on. One, right up front, Trump said the tariffs were going to cause some short-term turbulence or pain for some sectors. He acknowledged it. Agriculture has felt that a little bit. The row crop guys especially, but of course they solved some of that with the deal they cut with China. So I actually was in.
Did they solve that? Because I mean, I don't
soybeans?
think we would.
Oh yeah.
I don't think we would be talking about a $12 billion bailout. Well, A, and B, the amount that China has bought is not anywhere near what has been promised.
Okay, so they cut a deal with China, and they're in better shape today than they were when we didn't have a deal with China. So that's number one. Number two, I was in Texas Saturday night with the Texas Farm Bureau, spoke to a lot of farmers down there. It was interesting. There were some people that absolutely had concerns. In fact, I talked to one guy who was going to the White House meeting today, and they were glad to get invited to that. I think they feel like what the president's doing on the ag thing is responsive to them. They have concerns, not just tariffs. They're a little worried about the Argentinian beef issue as well. They threw that out. So, yeah, I mean, he's got some issues to work out. But overall, if you look at the Fed survey, people are happy and excited about the job market and the labor market in the United States. That's a good thing. And if you talk to Scott Bessent, he'll tell you that they think in 2026, we're going to see a boom in jobs and growth in this country, thanks to some of the structural changes they made this year. So they're expressing optimism and exuding optimism, and that's what they got to do going into an election.
There have been more than 1 million jobs lost so far this year, a number that basically rivals the pandemic time. So there is a picture of the economy that we're not getting from the federal government numbers, because those numbers are by and large not coming out. But from private sector payrolls, jobs are being lost right now, right at this moment.
We've seen actually for the first time in years, actual job losses month after month, revisions showing private sector job losses. And I think that is driving a lot of anxiety. And it comes at a time where The facts are that the tariffs are causing middle-class families, working-class families, to pay more money. They're $1,700 estimated by the Yale Budget Lab of how much families are paying more for the tariffs. And so I think what's really odd is that the president promised that inflation would come down on day one. He'd get rid of it. And instead, he went on this policy that I agree is just different from what Republicans have supported for decades, which is raising prices on people. And of course, the whole issue with the bailout of the farmers is if we didn't have these actually counterproductive tariffs, you wouldn't have to take taxpayer money to actually bail them out, because China's response on the soybeans is because of the president's tariffs policy.
I know all of human history started in January of this year, but I could take you back 4 years when input prices for agriculture, from fuel to materials to you name it, went through the roof. I know you know a little something about it because you worked under Joe Biden when it all happened. So these farmers, they're in a 10-month period here with Trump, but they just came out of a 4-month period where they were dying under the inflationary and affordability crisis caused by Democrats. They support this president. They like what he did today, and they're going to give him a little latitude to get out of it.
I don't think that's accurate when you hear from farm bureaus.
You don't think it's accurate that inflation happened under Biden?
I'm sorry, Donald Trump talked about, we definitely had inflation, but Joe Biden didn't pass tariffs that actually, with his own policy, actually increased prices for people. And I think what's really stunning is that 1 year in, Donald Trump's approval on economics is actually now worse than Joe Biden's. So all you want to talk about Joe Biden, the fact is people hold Donald Trump responsible because it's his policies that are adding to the burden on families.
Right. Scott Jennings in rare form as always. And the thing I find so frustrating about him is that he is basically just a suit with a smirk. Someone who loves staring into the camera with that silent attitude of, aren't these people adorable and clueless? Because he always comes armed with a rehearsed set of talking points that he delivers in a steamrolling way. And in the next part, you can clearly see him talking over Emma Vigeland, yet despite all that noise, he never really makes a real argument, since everything he says boils down to, what about Joe Biden? What about Barack Obama? What about the Democrats? And blaming everyone else, which is honestly the full extent of what he brings to the table. And to be fair, he is slick at doing it, I will give him that. But it is still just a smirk, a wrinkled brow, and nothing substantial underneath it. Because the truth is, you cannot realistically pin the situation on Joe Biden. And sure, there is a broader arc and no single president can be blamed for everything, but these tariffs were not put in place by anyone other than Trump. And I think you can draw a straight line from the trade wars Trump started for no real reason from the American public's point of view to the higher prices people are dealing with now.
Joe Biden, David Axelrod writes, Donald Trump recaptured the White House in part by relentlessly exploiting Biden's failure to heed widespread concerns about the rising cost of living. And now, bizarrely, President Trump is walking himself and his party into the same perilous trap by denying the economic reality that working families are living. It's kind of hard to argue that when, in some ways, Trump is literally saying a lot of the same things that people are just not feeling it. They're just not seeing how great it is, or that we just have to remind them that this is a PR problem and not an actual economic problem.
Well, Abby, I think we should put some of the president's comments into context. I think he is taking some of the celebrations on the prices that have come down, like we've talked about on your show before, prices on fuel, certain food items that are, in fact, coming down. And I think this, Scott's absolutely right. We should celebrate the fact that Americans are looking at this job market and saying we have a better chance at getting good, high-paying jobs and being able to support ourselves and our families. So, look, this is a reality that the American people are facing. The vice president came out and said, stick with us, give us some time, show a little grace on this issue. The president has said, hey, we're 11 months in.
Why should they show
and I think,
grace?
and I do think.
That's the part I don't understand.
Well, and I do think, Abby,
why should we show grace?
I honestly want to know.
We ask
I'm
for the
curious.
same grace.
We don't live in a snap election system.
As we suffered through 4 years, as I've said before, and I'll continue to say, as the worst inflation in my lifetime.
To your
and many
point,
Americans' lifetime.
This is a president who came into office and he said, this is going to be my top priority.
Yep.
That you all are suffering under the inflation of the Joe Biden administration. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to fix it on day one, he says. Why should then Americans, almost a year into this thing, turn around and say, well, you've raised prices on us through tariffs, but we're going to just give you some grace. That doesn't make any practical sense, and it doesn't make any political sense.
Would it make any sense to go back to the people who caused it in the first place?
No, well, if you ask voters, it's funny that you should bring
This guy is such a douchebag.
up, Scott, because if you ask voters, how much do you blame Trump for the current rate of inflation? 59% say a great deal, a good amount.
Well, he's the president. He is the head that wears the crown.
Exactly. He is the president.
But why go back to the people with the shovel digging the hole?
Emma.
Note that the inflation that occurred under Biden was in part naturally occurring due to supply chain bottlenecks and because the COVID once-in-a-lifetime pandemic occurred. And yes, it occurred.
Like we're on trees? Or?
Yeah, okay. So, because of supply chain bottlenecks. That's what I'm talking about. There was a labor shortage because of COVID.
Policy choices
and then there was this thing called greedflation, which was called a left-wing conspiracy theory. But then we saw record returns for corporations in their earnings, which showed that even though prices were going up, they were still taking home record returns, these corporations. And in part, the Biden administration tried to address that with Lena Khan and more enforcement. Now Trump's in office and there are no cops on the beat. We just hit a record of credit card debt in this country, over $1.2 trillion of credit card debt. We just hit a record in terms of subprime auto delinquencies, showing that people are really hurting. And there's something like the top 1% owns 50% of all stocks and trades. This is an income inequality problem as well as a tariff problem.
Trump is also blaming greedflation now for rising costs. And so, to your point, it was considered just sort of a Democratic talking point. Now Trump is doing the same thing. Again, you're seeing the same patterns playing out. And just for people at home who are just like, look, it's getting more expensive to live, they're not buying it. They weren't buying it with Joe Biden, and they're not buying it now.
The striking thing is, Republican tax and regulatory policy has been good for the economy. Even with that, you see huge inflation because of tariffs. But President Trump's signature economic policy was tariffs. I love tariffs. It's the most beautiful word in the dictionary. He goes on and on about it. And then when tariffs cause inflation, then he tries to say, no, they don't. But tax and regulatory policy has been favorable for business, but it's the uncertainty and the higher tariffs that are hurting the economy. And that's why the president is running away from it at certain times, or he'll exempt certain sectors or certain countries. But it's going to hurt coming into the elections, believe me, unless there's a reversal.
And he's hearing it from not just from voters, not just from Democrats, but also from Republicans in his own party as well.
So I think it is good that Jeff Flake, the former Republican senator from Arizona, is at least willing to admit that tariffs are bad and that Donald Trump is the reason those tariffs exist, even though Jeff Flake still tends to defend much of the modern Republican position. And I honestly doubt he would have said these things if he were still in office, because we have seen this pattern where politicians only start telling the truth once they decide not to run again, and suddenly they say what everyone already knows but refused to say while they were serving, which to me represents a real failure of responsibility by the Senate and Congress as a whole. Because their job is supposed to be acting as a check on the president. And I do not remember Jeff Flake seriously standing in the way of Donald Trump's agenda so much as simply stepping aside. So while I guess honesty is better than nothing, and I will take it at this stage, watching Emma Vigeland debate Scott Jennings really highlights the core issue here, which is that Scott Jennings functions as a propagandist, while Emma Vigeland clearly cares deeply about these issues, understands them well, comes prepared with evidence, and speaks quickly only because she is trying to fit in a large amount of real information, while he just sits there smirking because the substance does not matter to him since he has no real counter-argument. And this fake alternate reality that Scott Jennings and other MAGA commentators push is empty propaganda designed to sound convincing to someone who is half watching or has the TV on in the background, hoping that confidence and condescension will pass for winning while relying on baseless claims, half-truths, and selective facts. And I honestly think if Scott Jennings were not allowed to use "what about Biden" or "what about Obama," you would have nothing left to say at all. because he is essentially a stuffed shirt filled entirely with deflection, which is why I find myself questioning why CNN continues to present voices like his as if they represent legitimate counterpoints, when it is not reality versus reality, but reality versus fiction. And the danger is that giving that fiction airtime ends up legitimizing it, especially when he says something that is clearly false and shrugs it off as just his opinion, even though opinions do not get their own set of facts, which is exactly why I describe this as a coordinated propaganda effort. And on the issue of affordability, I think Republicans are on the losing side because people feel reality in their wallets and their daily lives. They see neighbors being taken from their homes by ICE. They see grocery prices rising, housing costs climbing, college becoming unaffordable, healthcare getting more expensive every year, and a minimum wage that has barely moved in decades. And you do not need to follow politics closely to understand that the person who promised to fix everything on day one clearly did not. Because while inflation did rise during COVID and continued after Biden took office, before peaking early and then gradually coming down to around 2 to 3%, those tariffs certainly did not help. Trump did not fix anything on day one, and sweeping bills that sound impressive have done nothing meaningful for everyday Americans. And proposals to replace ACA subsidies with small personal accounts that can't even be used for premiums are not solutions, but weak band-aids that fall apart the moment you face real medical costs, which just shows how out of touch wealthy Republicans are with the reality most people live in. Because while I am genuinely happy for anyone who earns a good living, the majority of people are scraping by paycheck to paycheck, and being told that affordability is not a real issue is simply not believable. So let me know what you think in the comments, because I am a big fan of Emma Vigeland. I respect how well prepared she is, how unafraid she is of people like Scott Jennings, and I admit that even though I am tired of his smug expression, I still get some satisfaction watching her calmly and thoroughly dismantle his arguments.